Hi, so we can have the next slide then, Carol. Thanks. I must apologize in this, part of the problem is my own computing problem. It may be that I have to go out and in again at some point and switch computers. So I'm going to try and get through the introduction and then I'm passed to Caitlin and I'll try and address my problems at that point. So this session, sorry.
Yeah.
Is there I'm hearing voices.
Perhaps people haven't got their mics muted. Could we mute our mics, please, everybody?
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks, Carol. We arranged this session actually on by comparing diaries, and it was only a few days after we'd arranged it on March the 8th that I realized that it was actually International Women's Day. So it's an extremely appropriate day on which to hold this session. If you can see me, I am in fact wearing my scarf in suffragette colours, and I'm very glad to welcome you all to this session. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, we know that we have a persistent gender pay gap. At the moment, the gender pay gap for all women is 15.4%. Often people quote that for full-timers as 7.9% and say, really, it's rather small. But we have to remember that women now have more education than men, and particularly those working full-time tend to be more educated. So actually, there should be a positive gender pay gap in favour of women, not a 7.9% gap. You'll see in a minute that the UK's gender pay gap is relatively high compared to European comparators. The figures vary, different data sets yield different amounts, but the real problem in the UK is actually the very low pay for part-time workers, much lower than other countries. So why is there still this problem? You know, it's 50 years after the Equal Pay Act was first passed, more than 50 years. Now, of course, the gender pay gap isn't the same as the legal right to equal pay for like work or work of equal value. As you know, as HR professionals, the latter applies only within organizations, within one employer source. So in fact, it doesn't address issues of segregation into different sectors and organizations. And that's responsible, particularly if you like, the segregation into many sectors that are primarily part-time. That is one of the major problems. But obviously, there is still a problem within organizations, and that's what we're going to be mainly talking about today. That's the basis on which people have to report gender pay gaps at an organization levels. And these gaps within individual organizations are often significant. I do say to people that actually you could have zero gaps within organizations, but still have a significant aggregate gender pay gap because women are all concentrated in low-paying firms. But in practice, it's a mixture of both. We have women concentrated in low-paying sectors, and we have organizations with significant gender pay gaps. And the reasons for these are both due to a lack of adherence to equal pay rights and to issues of segregation and progression for women over the life course. Let's have a look at the next slide, Carol. This is just to illustrate, it's the latest data that we have as an EU comparative level, and you can see the United Kingdom has already been separated from other EU 27 countries, and you can see how high it is. And as I say, it is primarily, or a large part, due to very low pay for part-time workers. Okay, let's move on. So why are we now talking about pay transparency in Europe? There's been a lack of progress in closing the gender pay gap in general, and that's led to consideration of what can we do about it? How can we kickstart change and raise awareness of continuing problems? And the European Commission introduced in 2014 a recommendation, which is a non-legally binding decision by the European Commission, to recommend to member states to introduce pay transparency measures. And it wasn't actually a coincidence, although the government, I think, didn't want to link it, that Cameron decided in 2015 to introduce gender pay gap reporting in the UK. This was very much in line with the recommendations they were receiving from the EU at the time. This came into force, as I'm sure you all know, from 2017 and has recently been restarted after a gap from COVID. But although countries like the UK and a few others did take action early on after the recommendation, action seemed to stall. And the new EU president, Ursula von der Leyen, made a commitment early on to a pay transparency directive. This was delayed. In fact, she said she'd have one in her first 100 days, but then COVID hit. And so the draft directive was slow in its development, but was presented about a year ago, slightly after International Women's Day last year. And it has been adopted by the European Council, but it's currently under discussion in European Parliament and will come back to Council eventually. And amendments and changes are still possible. So let's go to the next slide. So how are we going to organize this session? We're going to organize it in two parts. In a minute, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Caitlin Schmid, who's been working on the current experience of gender pay gap reporting in the UK with an institute in King's College London. And then we're going to come back to me to talk about the new pay transparency proposals, what these might mean for practice, and if they were applied in the UK. Now, unfortunately, unless somebody's seen that our institute managers managed to come back in, I don't think we can do the poll that we were planning. Is Lindsay online?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right, I can do
here.
polls,
right,
but I can't do the breakout rooms because I'm on my phone.
Right.
So I can still do the poll.
Let's do the polls.
Right.
And we'll talk about the breakout room. In fact, Carol, I was just wondering, can one of your colleagues help with putting people into the breakout rooms?
I don't have the option to do breakout rooms. So Lindsay, let's not do this in front of the audience, but could you make somebody else a host and see if they can get that option? I haven't got it. Should we just
I'll
go
do
with
my
the poll
best
for now?
Yeah,
I'll do my best with
sorry
that.
about this. I'm just trying to make the session go smoother later on.
Yeah.
So Lindsay, could we launch the polls then? Right, so as you can see, the first poll is, well, actually they're both on the same, sorry, I thought they were coming up separately. So we would like to know what you think about the gender pay gap reporting in the UK. And if you scroll down, there's a second poll, which is about whether it has led to changes in pay practices. So we'll give you, how are we doing? How many people are responding?
If there are 15 people, everybody has responded.
It
22,
says
15 of 22. But I think
25 participants. So we'll give them a few more seconds. And at this point, I think I'll pass to Caitlin to take over to discuss the poll results, as it looks as if we've only got 15.
I'm very sorry to say that I can't see the poll. Unfortunately, there's some issue on my end. So Jill, could you discuss the poll results? I'm very sorry.
Indeed, I've never come across this number of different problems.
Well, if they all happen today, we'll be fine in the future.
So we have 25% people think it's raised awareness a lot, 50% somewhat, 20% hardly at all, and 6% say don't know. So somewhat is the sort of norm, with about the same, either a lot or hardly at all. Has it led to changes in pay practices? 44% say yes, 44% say no, and 13% say don't know. Okay, let's end the poll now. Thanks very much for your participation. Actually, maybe if I say share results, people may be able to see that now. Okay, So I'll stop sharing the, oh, well, I'll stop sharing now. I'll put an end to that and pass to Caitlin.
Thank you very much, Jill. And thank you very much, everyone, for having me. Great to speak to you and welcome from my side as well. If Carol could move on to the next slide, you'll see that I want to speak about how we can push for progress on the gender pay gap in the UK by improving the gender pay gap reporting system. And I'm going to speak to you about research I conducted with my colleagues at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership last year, and this was in partnership with the Fawcett Society. And we conducted a comparative analysis of different countries, including the UK, to assess how effective the gender pay gap reporting system is. Sorry, could everyone mute themselves? Just, yeah, and we came up with some recommendations for improvement. And before I'll share these recommendations for improvement with you, I'll quickly go over the UK reporting obligation, although I'm sure you're all well aware of of this legislation. So can we go to the next slide, please, Carol? Yes, so as you know, since 2017, oops, something's wrong with that slide, I'm not quite sure. Since 2017, UK private and English public employers with more than 250 employees are required to include the overall gender pay gaps, calculated using both the mean and median average hourly pay, the proportion of women and men in each of these 4 pay bands, or divided into 4 pay bands, then the gender bonus gap, the proportion of male and female employees who are paid a bonus. And these figures are signed off by a senior individual certifying the accuracy of the report. And voluntarily, employers can also include a narrative explaining the gender pay gaps and any disparities found. And while this is highly encouraged, it's not a mandatory requirement, which I will be getting back to later on. So on the next slide, you can see that last year, nearly 10,000 companies reported, and they reported an average gender pay gap of 10.4% in these companies that are required to participate or to report. And we see that the majority of companies still report a gap that favors men. And this gap has been the same as in 2019, 2020 year. So clearly we're stalling, and we need to make progress on addressing this gap. So now I'll go to the research on the next slide. Thank you. So we conducted a 6-country case study looking at the reporting frameworks in Australia, France, Spain, Sweden, South Africa, and the UK. And we conducted over 80 interviews with key stakeholders, which included government officials, employers, trade union representatives, academics, and gender equality advocates. And we sought to establish how the gender pay gap reporting systems in these countries are perceived, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and how they could be improved. And so our aim was to identify the key elements that ensure that gender pay gap reporting systems are indeed effective. Coming to the findings on the next slide. Carol. So despite some significant variation between the country contexts we were looking at and also the legislation, certain key themes kept coming up. And sorry, I hear a very cute baby in the background. Could the person please mute themselves? Although, yeah, of course, we understand you're juggling work and responsibilities. Or can someone mute all participants? Carol, are you able to do that?
I don't think so. Sorry, I'm just looking at it. I don't think I can.
No problem. Well, I can continue.
Yeah.
So yes, significant country variation. We still found some key themes that we used to come up with our recommendations, and also we used to create a country ranking based on 11 indicators. And I'll be focusing on the UK recommendations, but I'll also be posting the link to the research if you want to read it on, up on the other countries. And while we found that the UK excels in its compliance and transparency levels, it fails in follow through. In particular, it became clear that the UK legislation has no teeth, as one interviewee put it, because it's focused on monitoring the problem rather than taking action. So consequently, the UK came in joint last place with Australia, scoring just 4 out of the 11 points possible. So in this context, we came up with key recommendations on the final slide. Carol, please. And we identified 4 areas in need of improvement. And the first is, we think it's necessary to establish a legal obligation for employers to publish action plans that are time bound and also offer measurable criteria, because this will help us move away from just reporting to actually implementing change. Ideally, these would be embedded within a more holistic equality assessment that also allows for intersectional analyses and also contextualize the figures beyond the issue of pay to see where the holdups are. So secondly, we think it's necessary to lower the minimum employee threshold for reporting, which is currently set at 250 employees. And in comparison to the other countries, this is relatively high. So for instance, in Sweden, this is 10 employees. It's 50 in Spain and France, and 100 in Australia. Thirdly, we also see the need for an introduction of automatic fines for non-submission of reports. Although compliance has been really high in the past few years, we think it's necessary to keep pressure high, so this high compliancy rate also continues into the future. And finally, we see the need to increase the capacity of the Government Equality Office and the Equality and Human Rights Commission to conduct more rigorous monitoring and analysis of the submitted data. And we'd be interested to hear what you think of these recommendations later on, if we manage to get the breakout rooms going. So thanks for your attention, and I'm handing back to Jill. You're muted currently.
So let's have a look at the next slide then. So moving on to what's being discussed in the EU at the moment. I find it quite remarkable how I've not seen one reference to the new Pay Transparency Directive in the press. We really have left the EU, and I'm not here suggesting that what's being proposed at the EU level will come in or influence the UK, but I think it's interesting and useful to think about what would have happened in the UK if we had remained part of the EU. So the directive proposals, I will be going into these in more detail, so I just sort of do the highlights here. There's a pay transparency proposal for job seekers, where employers will have to put the range of pay available in this role in the vacancy notice or provide before the job interview. And employers are not to be allowed to ask prospective workers about their pay history. That's really quite something we'll come back and discuss. Then there's a right to information for employees. Workers having the right to request information from their employer on not just on their individual pay level, on the average pay by sex for the categories of workers doing the same work or work of equal value, which, as you probably know, doesn't mean necessarily the same occupation, but jobs that can be rated, for example, in a job evaluation scheme as of equal value. Then there's the reporting on the gender pay gap, which is quite similar in many respects to what Caitlin's just outlined for the UK. So we're already doing that. But there will be more information on gender pay gaps by categories of workers doing the same work or work of equal value. And then here comes part of the teeth of this directive. If the pay gap is more than 5% and cannot be justified on objective gender neutral factors, employers will have to carry out a pay assessment in cooperation with workers' representatives. So those are the 4 proposals. There's more stuff in the directive, but this is what we're focusing on today. So next slide then, Carol. So what I thought was interesting was to consider what would be the effects if the UK was still in the EU and these measures were translated into UK law. So looking at the first two proposals, pay and data information for job seekers and employees, I've already mentioned range of pay specified in advance, employers not allowed to ask potential recruits about past earnings, workers not to be prevented from disclosing their pay for the purpose of enforcing the principle of equal pay between men and women for equal work or work of equal value. Some of you may know there have been at times restrictions on people being able to disclose their pay for these reasons, but it's gone back and forth in the UK. But this will be an EU-wide measure, which means that you cannot, that if you need that information, it has to be provided. And the right to receive average pay for occupation and like occupations, and occupations rated as providing equal value. Now, so what is the overall purpose of these provisions? I think that's the important thing to get hold of. And the aim is to ensure that workers have the necessary information to engage in balanced and fair negotiations regarding their salaries when they enter into an employment relationship. It would also ensure that existing pay discrimination and bias is not perpetuated over time, especially when workers change jobs. So those are the two main reasons for these two proposals. The next slide, please. So why this proposal? Well, there is evidence in the UK as well as elsewhere that differences in men's and women's starting salaries lead to lifelong pay differences in pay. Why do we get differences in starting salaries in the first place? Well, it's because men have been shown to be prone to using either current salaries or arguments about their market value to negotiate higher starting salaries than women. Women are more likely to accept this first offer, and men are more likely to come back and argue the toss, if you like, about how much they're worth and how much they should be paid. In addition, of course, if you base it on current salaries, this becomes cumulative over time. Because women may be trying to change jobs because their salary is low, but then they may only get a very small bump on top of their current salary, and a man starting in the same area might be getting more. Now, this is a bit problematic, and I know this, I think this might be one of the more controversial things that you might want to discuss. But equal pay legislation does mean that people should be paid the same for similar work or work of equal value. But if we use prior salaries, it suggests that we already know that a person is more productive than another recruit, even before they start work. And these presumptions may not be true. And even if found to be incorrect, there isn't much that employers can do to really correct it. It may be that you have performance-related pay, but in most situations, performance-related pay either leads to bonuses that are not recurring, or differences in pay increases. But if you have a higher percentage pay increase on a lower starting salary, for example, you actually may not get as much as your less well-performing male colleague who started on a higher salary with a lower percentage performance pay increase. So this is not a very effective way to level up differences. So let's go to the next slide. So obviously, some of the questions you might ask is, well, what happened? How does this work? What has happened? Have similar measures been introduced elsewhere? Well, I think one of the surprising things is that the country with the most evidence of salary history bans is the United States. In fact, by 2019, I haven't got further up-to-date things since COVID, 12 states in the United States had some version of salary history bans. 6 applied them in both public and private sectors, 6 in the public only. Now, what do we mean by a ban? It's clearly the case that applicants can still voluntarily, but mustn't be prompted, disclose pay history during the hiring process. But some states, and I don't really have the details, I haven't studied the US, but I'm just based on these articles I found, some states further restrict employers from using voluntarily disclosed or accidentally discovered information to decide pay. So as I said, there is a range of studies of this, and all of them suggest some positive effects. One study found that the bans reduced gender pay gap by 4.2 points in hourly wages and 4.5 percentage points in weekly earnings. When we look at hourly earnings, there was a rise in earnings for young and middle-aged women with at least some college education. And men's earnings tend to stay stable. But when they looked at weekly earnings, middle-aged men faced quite significant falls in weekly earnings. But this is based on data, we don't really know the ins and outs of how this happened at organization level. And another study in California of a salary history ban found that the gender earnings ratio, if you like, that's the obverse of the pay gap, increased by 1% in states with salary history bans. And this was driven primarily by those who had recently switched jobs. So there is quite a lot of evidence that it does work. I think we've gone back a slide, Carol. Can you go on? Right, and then the next one. So then to keep to, I think we actually are keeping to time. We may have to, I'm going to look at the other two proposals. First of all, the pay gap reporting. This is very similar, and I won't go into details to what's required at the moment in the UK. They are going to ask companies to make public on websites the average and median pay gap. And then again, and they will have to look at complementary or variable components, if you like, bonuses and performance related pay and other such factors. And they will have to look at the proportion of men and women receiving these bonuses and the proportion of female and male workers in each quartile pay band. For internal consumption, in other words, made available to workers and their representatives, and indeed to labour inspectorate and equality bodies on request, there will be information on the pay gap by categories of workers broken down by ordinary basic salary and complementary or variable components. And these categories of workers will be, if you like, rated as whether it's like work or work of equal value. And importantly, workers will be able to ask the employer for clarifications and details, including explanations concerning any gender pay differences. And the employer must make a substantive reply. And if they cannot justify them by objective and gender neutral factors, they must remedy the situation in close cooperation with the workers' representatives, the Labour Inspectorate and or the equality body. So that feeds into the next point, which is the next slide, Carol, which is a joint pay assessment. I've already mentioned this, but if there is a 5 percentage points or greater gap, and it cannot be easily justified by gender neutral criteria, a joint pay assessment is required. And what they mean by a joint pay assessment, it has to be done by the employer plus worker representatives, independently of whether or not it's unionized or not. Clearly, in a unionized organization, it's more likely to be trade unions. And this goes beyond reporting to require, and I'd like to emphasize this, the reasons for such differences in pay levels and to include objective gender neutral justifications, if any, but these have to be agreed by the workers' representative and the employer. The employer can't just say, this is why it's this is a gender neutral justification. They have to agree those justifications with the workers' representatives. They have to develop measures to address such differences if they're not justified on objective and gender neutral criteria. And they have to report on the effectiveness of any measures mentioned in previous joint pay assessments. And if the differences cannot be justified, the employer has to remedy the situation in close cooperation with workers' representatives, the Labour Inspectorate and equality body in some contexts. And such action shall include the establishment of gender neutral job evaluation and classification to ensure that any direct or indirect pay discrimination on grounds of sex is excluded. Next slide, please, Carol. So again, looking at where something similar has been tried, and the key example here is Iceland. Okay, it's a very small country, but it has done quite a lot. Now, I think it's worth noting that the EU directive does require member states to establish tools or methodologies to assess and compare the value of work in line with a set of objective criteria. And I'll leave you to read those as specified. That's a quote from the directive itself. So if you like, the member state has to set the context of what is meant by objective criteria, and then employers have to make accessible to workers a description of the gender neutral criteria used to define their pay and career progression. And this is in a way a bit similar to what's been happening in Iceland, because in Iceland in 2018, they introduced the first policy in the world requiring mandatory certification for employers with more than 25 employees that they pay men and women equally for a job of equal value. Now, importantly, there's some important things here. First of all, the burden of proof is on the employer. It's implemented through a job evaluation tool called the Equal Wage Management Standard. And if certification is not achieved, companies without certification incur a daily fine of $500, quite significant on a daily basis. So let's move to the next slide. And we have some preliminary evidence from Ina Wagner, who did a study on the effects of this. And employers did find the requirement to evaluate their work. They had to evaluate the tasks that the work involved and not the skills of the workforce, to be quite burdensome. But on the other hand, they recognized that once they'd done it once, that was it. It would be relatively easy to add in new jobs and new processes once they got a sort of database of how they'd evaluated those tasks. And despite the burdensome process, Ina Wagner found that managers were appreciating some positive impacts on HR outcomes. They found they ended up with a straightforward structure, absolving some of the responsibility from individual line managers in determining pay. They identified an increase in trust in the employer amongst female employees, and a sense of pride amongst all employees being part of such a progressive project. So a quote here: "The system has stimulated both in-firm and societal discussions about how jobs are valued based on what criteria and whether these criteria are still relevant in the current society and labour market." So that's a good lead in to the last slide, which was to look at some key discussion questions, which is what should be done about the UK gender pay gap reporting? What reforms, if any, would you favour, going back to some of the points that Caitlin was making? And then drawing on my two examples, should organisations specify salary bands in their job adverts and or make pay offers that are not linked to applicants' previous salary? And finally, do you think it would be useful to start a wider conversation in organisations and indeed in the wider society, as to some extent happened under COVID, about what criteria should be used for setting pay? Now that's the end of our slides. I'm not, because I've been talking, I haven't been able to follow where we are with respect to breakout rooms, which was the plan. Lindsay, are you still on?
I can do the breakout rooms.
Can you? Okay, good. So we're going to have a bit shorter time. How many breakout rooms do you want, Carol?
Should we do 4?
4, please.
4.
Okay, so I'm going to automatically randomly allocate you. I think that might be the easiest at this point, so we don't lose too much time. Or Carol, do you disagree?
Well, we were trying to have a facilitator, but if that's too complicated, let's just have a random allocation. Yeah.
Okay, let's hope this
Hey,
works.
Caitlin, can I ask that the slide or the questions are put into the chat function,
I'm
so
just
that when
doing.
everyone goes in the room that we have them to review?
Just doing that, Paul, now.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, oh, I can move. Yeah, I can make sure we are evenly distributed, us hosts. So, okay, I think we.
If anybody wants to add to the chat now with questions, that's right. I'm going.
I think you should all be able to see that now.
I'm going to stay in the room in case if someone falls out, I'll pop them back in.
Not sure we've got Jill and Caitlin back yet. So.
I'm back.
Oh, you're back, Caitlin. Hello. Are we doing a report back, or are we just?
Yes, I think that would be very helpful.
Okay. Do you want me to do while I'm here?
Yes.
So we had a really interesting discussion. It was so interesting that we didn't really get much past question 1, I'm afraid. We had some really good discussions around question 1. So a sense actually that on social media, LinkedIn, there's a growing discourse around the idea of transparency, possibly not a lot of action yet, but at least that kind of sense that interest is being generated. I guess our social medias are particular kinds of social medias, aren't they, where we're all connected into other HR people, but at least in that community, growing recognition and discussion of it. Interestingly, still quite a lot of misunderstanding around gender pay gaps versus equal pay, and a kind of an education piece around that to be done. And then we had a really interesting point about how do we go about embedding this. So we had 2 different points of view. So one was around we should have financial sanctions and we should maximize reputational damage, that kind of very punitive approach. But a concern, a counter concern with that about people might just do it because it's a tick box exercise and they have to do it. So we talked about more positive things like tax breaks or some form of accreditation, like the disability type accreditation, to make it more mainstream and to bring businesses with us rather than set them against us, but also recognizing that size is important. It's a very different issue and different size of organizations. And we finally agreed to kind of, there was a room for both, if you like, in there. And then we had a very short debate around salary bands and not using previous salary, but largely some support for that, but also a view that we talk a lot about salary, but we should think about total reward. It's more than just salary, and make sure we build all that in. So that's a whistle-stop report, but we had some really interesting discussions. I don't know if anybody from my group wants to add any more to what I've said. Okay, so can we hand back to you, Caitlin?
Thank you very much. Jill, do you want to report back from the second group?
Okay.
Jill, I made some notes from our group. Would it be easier?
Yeah,
you go through those.
Be good.
Yeah. So there was a conversation really about the gender pay gap and its calculation, and in some organisations we're using a lot of this as evidence, but is it even being calculated correctly? Are people using the right data in smaller organizations where they maybe don't have a reward or a data team? And therefore, is it doing very much if we're not using the right data? And then I think we had a bit of a really strong element of the recruitment market at the moment is a candidate's market, which really determines that the candidate is the one driving the pay. And if that is a critical role for the business, then that business might need to pay higher. And that's irrelevant whether it's male or female. It's just that they need that skill set, and it's a rare skill set or a technical niche. We had one attendee who was able to say that in her business, it's her company, so she's able to make sure that there's pay equality because she has that overall control. And it's maybe a way of highlighting those cases and saying this is how it does work when you apply it. And the conversation then about advertising the pay range, and again highlighting that can be very difficult if you are looking for people and then somebody comes in with additional skills and you're willing to pay an extra 30k if it's got that extra skill set or the extra experience that you need. And Jill made the analogy of the higher education sector, which is where I work as well, and that often that might be done as, okay, so you're advertising for a lecturer, but when somebody comes in with that greater experience, you might be able to actually say, well, we could make this a senior lecturer post, and therefore the pay differential and the salary differential can be justified because you've actually expanded the grade based on the candidate's experience. So I think that was a lot of the conversation that we had. Jill, would you add anything?
No, I think we didn't really get very far beyond the first 2 questions. But I think it's quite interesting that people don't think that the current arrangements are actually delivering what we need. And so I think there is a need to actually, add a bit more teeth to it, because otherwise I think people will get bored with doing these pay gap reporting when it's not leading to anything. I think that was something that perhaps just to emphasize.
And have we got one final group, or was that all the groups?
So it turned out to be just 2 groups. I'm
Two
very
groups, okay.
sorry.
No, that's absolutely
I think it
fine.
worked out well. I mean, these discussions sound really, interesting and also highly relevant and productive. So I think it worked out.
Yeah, really well. I am conscious of time, but I am just going to ask anybody if they want to add anything in before we end. No, well, thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, and I enjoyed the presentation, and I messaged you guys as I do have a lot of experience working in this field and progressing it beyond where we currently are. So I look forward to talking to you. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Clearly this has been a CIPD Fellows Forum. I think I might even have forgotten to say that in my tech distress at the beginning. So thank you very much all for coming along. It's always great to have these sessions. We deliberately plan them to be reasonably small, then we can have these kind of discussions with other senior people. And I think we have seen some really, really fruitful discussions in the breakout rooms. And hopefully you will also now have some contacts and networks should you need to take those further forward. And of course, Jill and Caitlin, you have their details. I have been asked in the chat to circulate slides, and we will, and we'll circulate a recording as well. So there'll be plenty of opportunities to review and to listen further. We'll have another meeting coming up, Fellows Forum in June. We've not got a date yet, but that will be like the June meeting last year, where it's all the northern branches, fellows in the northern branches come together. So we'll publish that at an appropriate moment. So for now, it just remains really for me to thank Caitlin and Jill for a fantastic session. I think it's been really interesting. I think the debates in the rooms have demonstrated that, and I have learned a lot. So thank you, Jill and Caitlin. And hope you have a good rest of International Women's Day.
Yes, we're going
Thank
to
you
do
very much.
Thanks
so
a lot
much.
for coming. Right.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Caitlin, as you're the host, I think you have to stop the recording.
Okay, will do. Thanks, Lindsay. We made it. Oh, wait.